We want a country where everyone lives a long and healthy and productive life in caring relationships with others. And I want to start by talking about my doctoral dissertation. But don't worry, as an 82-year-old man, I am not going to take you through my entire history. This is a graph. This is from my doctoral dissertation. We were interested in the characteristics of academic areas. And so I did a multidimensional scaling of all of these academic areas. And what we found was a three-dimensional organization of things. And I'm going to just show you two of these. One of them was the one which I came to call a paradigm versus no paradigm. And over here on the paradigm side, you can see that there are things like microbiology and physics and mechanical engineering and so on. And all of these were areas, academic areas, where it's a pretty clear paradigm what we're doing, and everybody is working in that paradigm. And one of the things we found was that in these organizations, there were a lot of multi-person authored papers, which was not true in the ones that were not didn't have high levels of paradigmatic. And what I noticed, by the way, was that psychology was not on the paradigmatic side. And I think in 1973, that was about accurate. But that was what prepared me to realize, to become a Skinnerian. Because what I learned from Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was this whole notion of paradigms is where I got that. And so when I began to read some of Skinner's work, I realized that what Skinner was proposing was essentially a paradigm saying that all aspects of human behavior and behavior of non-humans could be understood in terms of the consequences of their behavior. And that was a change, and that was something that Darwin really began. And you keep in mind that science up to that point was mostly a science of antecedents affecting things. And so that was the beginning of my movement as a human, a person doing a Skinnerian approach to human behavior. That eventually led to my writing a book on changing cultural practices, which was basically taking an evolutionary approach to cultural practices as being shaped by the consequences of those practices. And that's the way I've been thinking. And when I met David Sloan Wilson, I thought, hey, this is really good. The other thing that really affected my thinking was public health. I did a lot of work on tobacco control. And when you start thinking in terms of a problem like tobacco use, you start to think about the incidence and prevalence of smoking and the incidence and prevalence of the disease that are consequences of smoking. And the same thing could be said about child abuse and neglect and virtually all of the problems. So I've come to think about the problems at a community and national level as being a matter of reducing the incidence and prevalence of problems and increasing the incidence and prevalence of pro-social behavior. Denny Fishbein and Ron Prince and I published a paper about 2 years ago on proposing a comprehensive framework for understanding health inequities and disparities. And here's the public health approach. We're interested in reducing the prevalence of disability and the incidence of premature death. And so what we said was that physiological stresses and all of these risk factors had been shown to be significant factors affecting the incidence and prevalence of disability and premature death. And in addition, there's been a lot of research not only showing that these are risk factors, but also showing how we can reduce these things. That, for example, the work that I and many other people did to reduce tobacco use, which has been significantly reduced thanks to the research and policy that occurred. So this is a lot of what prevention science has been doing, is focusing on these things. But what we argued was that that is not sufficient to deal with these outcomes because there are structural and social determinants of health and determinants of health disparities. Poverty and discrimination and harmful marketing are three of the most important. And so we argued that if you don't deal with these problems, you're going to have a limited impact on these outcomes and a limited impact on changing these risk factors. But the other thing is that you have to look at public policy and the way in which public policy is a major risk factor for these things. And that's what one of the major things that's been driving my thinking and my work of late. So let me talk first about the evolution of neoliberalism. And if you really want to get into it, my book, Rebooting Capitalism, describes this in some detail. The first thing I'd mention is the Powell memo. Lewis Powell was a prominent lawyer. He was on the board of the Philip Morris et al. And he wrote a memo to his neighbor who was in the chair of the, I've forgotten the group, but anyway, very influential.
Chamber of Commerce, Tony, wasn't it? Or Better
Yes.
Business? Chamber of Commerce out there.
Yeah, at the national level. And so that memo had quite an influence on wealthy people. It basically said that if business people were not going to become more politically active and advocate for their interests and needs, that they would be losing. And this was written at a time when there were something like 1,700 bombings of businesses in the United States. So the business people had every reason to be concerned. If you want to follow this out in detail, you could read the book Jane Mayer wrote called Dark Money. That describes how, and again, this is selection by consequences. There was rewarding the advocacy for free market economics was what the business people started to do. And so they nurtured the careers of economists, and they also maneuvered to get a Nobel Prize in economics, not really a Nobel Prize, a so-called economic prize, to raise the belief that economists knew what they were talking about. And then there was Milton Friedman's essay in the New York Times in 1970 that said that the only business of corporations should be to maximize their profits. And then there was the Federalist Society, which nurtured the careers of all kinds of lawyers, 4 or 5 of whom are on the Supreme Court. And that's the Supreme Court appointments. And to add to this, just this morning, I asked AI to find out what did Milton Friedman get in the way of funding as an example of the way in which his activities were nurtured. And so he and his wife wrote a book called Free to Choose, and there was a PBS series about it. And this is a list of the people who gave money. And if I had $500,000, there'd be a lot more action in terms of rebooting capitalism. So, but again, selection by consequences. So what happened? Well, the business people started working on this stuff around 1970. And this is a graph of the light blue is the income of working class people. And this one is the productivity of the companies. So what you see is that about 1970, they began to diverge, and the corporations were getting a lot more productivity, but it wasn't being shared with working class people. And so if you come over here, you see that the top 1%, this is between 1970 and 2020, and you can see that the top 1% versus the bottom 50%, it's a huge change. So that's part of what was the result of the neoliberalism. But here's another thing, and that's economic inequality. This is an index on this dimension of all of these various problems. And Wilkinson and Pickett did in their book Spirit Level, did an analysis of these problems and the degree to which they were associated with income inequality. So here you have countries that are arranged in terms of the degree of economic inequality. And what you see is that the countries with the lowest level of economic inequality also had the lowest levels of problems with respect to life expectancy, homicides, imprisonment, and so on. And guess what? USA, we're number 1. We have the highest level of economic inequality of any country. And another interesting thing about this is that countries with high levels of economic inequality actually have higher levels of problems for the wealthiest people as well as poorer people. And the reason seems to be that in an economically unequal country, people are running into other people who are richer than they are, poorer than they are, and it causes friction that appears to be a risk factor for these problems. So profit maximization that Milton Friedman called for has produced these results. And if you use this QR code, you can get a connection to all of the publications that are relevant to the claims I'm about to make. Significantly higher health disparities. We published a paper last year detailing the way in which health disparities are higher as a result of corporate profiting via harmful marketing. And then there's the harmful marketing of products. We have a paper that accounts for about 1 million excess deaths a year due to harmful marketing in the US. Then there's family poverty, a huge risk factor. I'll come back to that. Economic inequality, I've already shown you. And we have a Supreme Court that has undermined more perfect union, justice, domestic tranquility, and the general welfare and liberty. We are systematically looking at the relationship between Supreme Court decisions and these outcomes. And we're up to probably 9 essays. We've published about 5 of them so far, and we'll be publishing the rest of them. So this is, I would argue, all about cultural evolution in the good old USA, and we got problems. So the projects that we believe need to be high priority based on this and based on the risks associated are reducing family poverty, ending the marketing of products that contribute to more than 1 million excess deaths a year, publicizing Supreme Court decisions that are undermining the aspirations that the preamble of the Constitution articulated. And let me say one more thing about that. Over the last 6 months, I have not found a problem that I cannot connect with Supreme Court decisions that contributed to that problem. I was at a conference a month ago, and I realized that, oh, we've done nothing about greenhouse gas emissions. Half an hour later, I got 5 Supreme Court decisions that have directly contributed to that. Then there's increasing the well-being of the people in the African refugee and immigrant community in Oregon. We are working with that community, and actually we're going to start an ACT intervention for refugee women. Okay, and then there's promoting psychological flexibility, and we are working on that. Ali Sharko was a student of Steve's at UNR, and she is doing excellent work in that. And so we're going to offer that in the coming months. And then there's promoting pro-social values in AI systems. We've begun to look at that because there's a huge issue here about what the values of AI systems are and how we might ensure that those values be consistent with the kinds of pro-sociality that I think we could all agree we want. And we're not sure how much we can get in that. We're just getting started on that. So the other thing is that all these efforts are supported by a subcast and podcast system that's reaching a growing number of people. And I would pause for a moment to ask you to take your camera out and use this QR code to go to the Substack place and subscribe. We're trying to get as many people there as possible because our influence depends on how many people we reach. By the way, we also do podcasts, and we did one with Steve Hayes. Maybe David Sloan Wilson would like to do a podcast for us.
Always.
Okay.
The answer is yes.
Okay. So Supreme Court decisions that trample on the aspirations of the preamble: gun deaths, Native American well-being, voting rights, harmful marketing, government regulation, discrimination, Citizens United, family poverty, civil rights, greenhouse gas emissions, and premature deaths resulting from allowing states to not take funds from the Affordable Care Act, which was a Supreme Court decision that led to that. And so one of the things we're proposing to do, we're getting started with, is we're calling Voices for Reform. And what we want to do is give people a way of speaking clearly and respectfully about the harms they see and the justice they seek. So what we're inviting people to do is write letters to justices who have participated in decisions that are doing harm. We can write those letters for them, or we can help them write them themselves. Each statement will name the harm, describe the values at stake, and call for reforms that would better protect justice, democracy, human dignity, and the well-being of all people. Now, with permission, statements will be published publicly and gathered into periodic collections, and they will be sent to those relevant justices. And these collections will be respectfully delivered to the Supreme Court and to Congress and civil leaders and so on. And you may say, well, how could this really make a difference? Well, it won't make a difference if 20 or 30 people do it. But if we could get 1,000 people, then we're starting to move the dial on this. And I would argue that virtually every major change we've had in society, in the U.S. society, was the result of people speaking up. And if you look at the civil rights movement or women's rights movement or one on drunk driving, all of the, well, certainly the first two I mentioned, people were speaking up for it, but a lot of the key people weren't listening. But it caused enough enough people to speak up that it began to get the attention it needs. And I think that this is one that has that potential because we need to reform the Supreme Court, and we can reform the Supreme Court. The Congress can make a number of changes that are badly needed, but a lot of people don't realize that and don't realize that this is a key issue for our dealing with the problems we have. So then there's family poverty. And these are risk factors, all risk factors for family poverty. And this is why family poverty is a huge problem that needs to be addressed. There's higher levels of child abuse and neglect. There's greater family stress. There's the developmental delays. There's school readiness problems. There's anxiety and depression and antisocial behavior and substance use and premature mortality and teen pregnancy and so on. You get the picture. We need to do something about family poverty. And by the way, U.S. is not number one, but we're high up there in terms of the proportion of children who are living in poverty. And so this is another reason that we need to be focused on this problem. We think that action circles could help increase family income. We've identified communities that are making some progress in getting low-income families to use things like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. And so we want to partner with tax prep programs, and we're reaching out to them. But we also want to do this in a way that we can invite other communities to start doing the same thing. And we've got a whole long list of ways in which we could increase family income. But I'm going to run out of time, so I'll keep moving. Harmful marketing, 1 million premature deaths, tobacco, alcohol, unhealthful food, guns, fossil fuels, social media, pharmacology, gambling. And so we think action circles to help communities reduce harmful marketing would be useful, and they would protect children and families. And I've done a lot of work on this with respect to the marketing of tobacco and alcohol. And I have some colleagues in Texas who've agreed to join us who would work on other aspects of this. And there's, by the way, a recent, I don't know if I have social media in here, but there's a recent court decision that's beginning to put some controls over how social media is reaching young people. I should simply say that an action circle generally consists of 10 to 12 people who agree to work over a short period of time, maybe 2-3 months, to reach a very specific goal or outcome. And so, for example, helping a community set up a system to increase family income would be something that an action circle could do. The problem we have is that it's very hard to get communities to, start to do these things. I realized only recently that I did 2 randomized trials that I just alluded to. One was a randomized trial for reducing adolescent tobacco use, and we randomized 8 of 16 communities to get a comprehensive approach to that. And we had a significant impact on that. But I also had $700,000 a year for 5 years from the National Cancer Institute to do that research. And we didn't have any trouble getting communities. We had enough money that we could go in and we could do that. And I realized that the last 2 years, I've been trying to influence communities and so on. And we're now about to put in a proposal to a foundation where we're saying, can't specify the communities that are going to be involved in the study we're proposing, but if you give us the money, we'll have the communities. So, and I already talked about how we're working with the refugee women. There's a wonderful ACT intervention that was developed for women who are refugees, and WHO did about 3 randomized trials of it, and we're going to do it. And we're also helping them. We're trying to get funding to create a sewing organization so that these women can learn how to sew and possibly make a living doing that. So the choice we have is between pro-sociality and materialism. We're going to have respect and love and patience or kindness, or we're going to have selfishness and conflict. And so I think that everybody on this call is working on this and all trying it in different ways. And by the way, variation and selection, the variation is very important for the evolution of these efforts. So I put myself as one of the people, but all of you guys are doing wonderful work. Oh, and I was going to mention that back to the letters that we want to deliver to the Supreme Court. I just had this vision that the Chip House is in Washington, and maybe the day will come that he'll be willing to take 1,000 letters and put them on the first step of the Supreme Court, which I'm told you can do without getting arrested. And so, Chip, I'm hoping that you'll agree to that task, but we have to get the letters. So, the last thing I want to say is that there's a huge need for social movements. The progressive era was huge in the first half of the 20th century. It moved people. It reduced poverty. That and the Roosevelt FDR's presidency significantly improved the well-being of poorer people. And then there was the civil rights movement. There's a wonderful book by David Halberstam on the history of that, and that changed things enormously. And there's been some backsliding, and we're working. We need to work on that. But I mean, if you read this book, you'll learn about all of the terrible things that were being done to Black people from the time of fairly soon after the Civil War and into the 1960s. Then there's the women's rights movement and gay marriage movement and the work against drunk driving and the tobacco control movement. And also there's pushback against ICE. But we need a social movement, and I'll leave it at that. So Values to Action can provide an act for a nurturing nation, training and guidance for action circles, an opportunity to guide our work through open mic events, and an opportunity to make differences in the most important national crisis in your lifetime. And, I was really affected by Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about her husband, who was there when it happened. He was the speechwriter for JFK before he was elected and while he was in the White House, and he was a speechwriter for Lyndon Johnson. And I reread that, and I remembered when I was the president of the students for Robert Kennedy at the University of Illinois, and it was such an exciting time, and young people were really involved, and it was probably the most exciting time of my life. And I submit that joining some aspect of the social movement that's needed is something that can just improve everyone's life. And so if you want anything more, email me at tony@bigland.org.